Dr. Anna Muraco is an associate professor of sociology here at LMU. And in addition to being the author of Odd Couples, Friendship at the Intersection of Gender and Sexual Orientation, which you'll be hearing about this evening, she is also a co-investigator on the Caring and Aging with Pride project, which is the first national project to study health and wellness among lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender older adults and their caregivers. So her areas of expertise in research and teaching include social relationships, social gerontology, families, LGBT populations, gender, sexuality, and qualitative methodologies, all of which I believe we'll be talking about this evening. So I'm very grateful to Dr. Muraco for sharing her expertise and time with us. So if you can please join me in sending a warm welcome.
Thank you all for being here today. I'm going to keep tabs. I'm not texting, I promise. I'm keeping tabs on the time because I have a tendency to go a little long. And so I want to give plenty of time for comments and questions. So before I get too well started, she doesn't know I'm going to do this, but my mom is here, and she's never seen me talk about my book before. And she was also really not feeling very good yesterday. And so it's a testament to my mom that she's here for us today. So my mom is in the back, so she's going to probably feel very shy. It's very exciting to have her here for me today. Okay, so Odd Couples is the name of the book. I think that a good place for me to start is how this came about. I was a graduate student. I was struggling. I did not know what I wanted to focus on. There were lots and lots of things that were interesting to me. And I happened to be working with Lynn Loughlin, who is a qualitative methodologist and a sociologist. And her point was, when she talks to her students, she says, start from where you are. And the point was to start from where you are. I thought, well, what does she mean by that exactly? And the idea was, what's interesting to you? What's meaningful to you? And so I started with that. I was also at that time working with a faculty member on looking at friendships for older adults. And at that time it wasn't older LGBT adults, it was just older adults. And I started noticing that there were gaps in the literatures, which is something that we as social scientists do. We see, hey, there's something that's not there. Let's see what we can do about it. So between my own interest in gay-straight friendship and between the gaps in the literature, I thought, okay, I might have found something here. This was also happening at a particular cultural moment. At the time, Will and Grace was on TV. This took me a long time to do, by the way. This was a long project. and I think Will and Grace started in I don't know, a long time ago. That's all I know. And I was in graduate school, and it was everywhere. And at that time, it was not the only example of pop culture dealing with gay-straight friendship. There was also that spate of awful movies, starting with, I think it was Jennifer Aniston and something about her best friend, or I don't remember the title. There was My Best Friend's Wedding. That was Julia Roberts and Rupert Murdoch. Everett. That's good. That's awesome. Something else is going on in here. Everett, right, that's the one. There were a lot of pop culture references to these gay-straight friendships, and I myself am a straight woman, and my best friend is a gay man. My roommate at the time was a lesbian. She had a very close, she had a close straight male friend, and the girlfriend of her at the time also had a very close straight male friend. So I just was thinking, okay, so we've got life imitating art, imitating life, and that's what I decided to focus on. What I did find, however, absent from this was the lesbian straight man friendship. There were I still can't really think of very many media examples of them, unless we talk about Chasing Amy, which is a very complicated situation. So I'm not going to even go into that. Now, what at the time, and what I still continue to look at, is the questions that fuel my scholarship are things about inequalities and how these things get replicated in smaller units. So we talk about social inequality as a societal thing, but I'm interested in how do these patterns play out in smaller units, in friendships, in relationships. I was also interested in the when Harry met Sally, can men and women be friends question. I thought that also it's important to indicate that there are lots of assumptions going on here. There's an assumption of heterosexuality. When we ask the question, can men and women be friends, we're assuming that we're talking about heterosexual people in general. There's also the model of thinking as men and women as fundamentally different from each other. I call it the men are from Mars, women are from Venus phenomenon. Not one that I ascribe to, but one that we generally approach these friendships these relationships as if men and women are so distinctly different. A third thing that I was really interested in is I was wondering if we remove the sexual tension aspect, which seems to be something that a lot of the question about the Harry met Sally, can men and women be friends element, if we remove sexual tension, how can men and women be friends, and how does it affect the power relations within those relationships? So those are the things that I started from, the place that I started from. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about methodology today because we're not all sociologists, and I think it might be a little dry, but I will just give you some general outlines of what I did. I started with this work in the Bay Area in the early 2000s. The way I sought people out was looking specifically for people who were openly identifying as gay or lesbian. The reason for that is it's a lot easier to find gay and lesbian people and see if they have straight friends than just start randomly talking to straight people and see if they have gay or lesbian. So that was how I started with that. I did in-depth interviews where I sat with folks and talked to them for sometimes an hour, sometimes two, sometimes longer, and asked them a series of questions that I asked of everybody that I interviewed. I interviewed one person at a time, and I would interview both parts of friendship pairs. So I would interview one person, and then either later that day or in the near future, I would interview the other person. Now, when I did that, I was making a concerted decision. Because if I had interviewed them together, I would have gotten to see some of the dynamics that played out in their relationship. But because I interviewed them separately, I was able to get at some of the things they may not have admitted in front of each other. And so I had to make that decision, and that's a decision that as an interviewer, as a qualitative sociologist, I often have to make. How do I make those decisions that I make that shape my study? There's some students sitting in here who have been in my research methods class, so they know how much I think about these things and how much all of these different choices you make as a researcher shape the study that you end up having. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of the themes that are in the book. Still keeping track of my time. So basically, this study focuses on I used as a foundation for this work the body of friendship research that exists, how intersectional friendships, which is what I call these friendships, fit into the existing studies. Now, I will say, one thing I want to say is that intersectionality is something that is very commonly discussed in contemporary scholarship. And my research is intersectional to a degree. I talk about race and I talk about class when it is important to the study, or to the part of the study that I'm talking about. Typically, when we talk about intersectionality, it incorporates the intersections of race and class and sex and gender and all of these different social categories. I needed to do this pretty strategically because it becomes very difficult to try to boil down what it is that I'm looking at with respect to gender and sexuality and sexual orientation in the study. So it's intersectional insofar as it's crossing these boundaries of sex and sexual orientation. But it's really, I wouldn't say it's not necessarily fully intersectional in that I'm not doing really close readings on race in class. So just, I feel like it's important to make that really clear from the outset. So some of the other themes I talk about. I talk about friendships as family. That's one of the chapters in the book. I talk about gender and the ways that these friendships both resist and reinforce social norms. I talk about the role of sexuality, how sexuality plays a role in the friendships. And this is one of the interesting points because most of the people who I interviewed said that they particularly value these friendships because it lacks a presumption of sexuality or sexual tension. But yet, these people are complicated, and the sexual tensions play out in really interesting ways in the friendships. And I'm not going to tell you too much about that because I'm going to focus more on gender today, but that's like a little teaser, I think. But I'm also really happy to answer questions about it as well. And then the last chapter of the book, I talk about how straight people in the friendships get politicized. The idea that having a friend who is a gay or a lesbian person often makes the struggle for civil rights more personal, and it makes them act in ways that they may not have perceived themselves to act previously, meaning that they really take a defensive stance on the behalf of their friends. But these sort of politicized ideas and actions are limited in that they're willing to do some things but not go way overboard. And by overboard, I mean overboard as they see it. Okay, so that's enough about the book. Now I'll read you some from the book. I wanted to introduce you to a couple of the friendship pairs who I interviewed. And also I'm going to first introduce you to Emily and Patrick. Emily and Patrick have been friends for more than a decade. Patrick was the first friend that Emily had when she relocated for a job nearly 15 years ago. Patrick, her coworker, showed her around her new city. Emily and Patrick are white and in their 40s, and they work in the same office dedicated to environmental preservation. They're both in long-term relationships. Emily had a commitment ceremony to celebrate her same-sex partnership with Stacy several years ago, and Patrick has been married for 10 years. When I asked Emily what she and Patrick have in common aside from work, she explained, quote, "I know we both enjoy the outdoors, so we definitely have a lot of common values. We're right in about the same place in terms of economically, so we have a lot of the same struggles, and we're very close in age. So in terms of, the kinds of stages we've gone through, 20s, 30s, 40s, that's all pretty common too." Patrick also characterized his close bond with Emily, and he says, quote, "I have a tendency to think, outside of the context of this conversation, if you had said, who are your close friends? I would name, a friend from high school who I'm still in close touch with, my wife, maybe nobody else. And I wouldn't immediately think of Emily. But then again, that's kind of taking this bifurcated take on life, where work isn't life, and then when I consciously include what I do at work, it's really clear that Emily is a close friend." Both Emily and Patrick identified some of the unique dimensions of their friendship that come from its being intersectional. Patrick explained the benefits he reaps from having Emily present in the workplace. He says, quote, "We've, I think, talked to each other about our feelings of professional inadequacy, which is something that's hard to do with a spouse, because a spouse is going to say, you're fine, you're really great, just don't think about it." It's different to be able to talk about it with someone at work, and to be talking at a more detailed level saying, "You know what? My project handling skills suck. I'm good at project development, but I'm just not following through. I'm letting my deadlines slip and feeling really bad about that." That's a conversation that's something in our friendship that is safe ground. I don't know if this is one of your later questions, but I think that it's safer to have that kind of a conversation with a woman. I don't know that I would be so ready to have that conversation with a man. And then he continues on, he says, "Sometimes when you've got a gender difference, a friendship has some sort of sexual undertones or whatever, and there can be like a flirtatious kind of aspect of a friendship that maybe can sometimes lead further. On one hand, it can be a plus for a relationship, but a lot of times it can be a negative, especially in the long run. But I think that because Emily's and my friendship has really never had that, maybe there's slightly more distance in some ways at different times than there otherwise would have been. So what this is basically showing us is a lot of the key themes that are present throughout the book here. On the one hand, we've got similarity, which is a very common element of friendship. We've got the difference in sex. We've got Emily, she's a woman. Patrick, he's a man. Emily is a lesbian. Patrick's a straight man. But a lot of the other elements of their background, their demographics, are similar. They're similar in age. They have a similar background. They have similar jobs. They're both in long-term relationships. And so in those ways, they actually have a lot of similarity. And that's one of the things that's very consistent with research about friendships, is that while people like to focus on the differences that exist, in fact, when we look at the demographics, we see that in a lot of ways, they're actually quite similar. A second thing that is present in this particular friendship is the ways that Patrick is able to disclose his feelings of inadequacy at work to Emily. And he says himself that he would feel less comfortable being able to disclose those kinds of feelings to a male at work. And so in that way, it's on the one hand, they've got this very nice relationship. It's fairly equitable in some ways. But on the other hand, they're reinforcing this idea that he's able to disclose this to a woman and not a man because he expects her to be more supporting and to really, it's a safe place is what I'm trying to say. It's a safe place for him to be able to express those kinds of feelings. So now I'm starting to hint at the gender stuff that's going on here. Next, I'm going to read a bit about Scott and Ruth, which we'll do in a second. Myself on time here. Okay, Scott and Ruth. Scott and Ruth met in 1977 when they were both 22 years old. Initially, they met through Ruth's husband, Tony, who was the only straight man living in a gay residential hotel where Scott also lived. Ruth and Tony divorced, but because they were musicians, they continued to hang out in the same circles, and eventually Ruth met Scott. Ruth and Scott became friends through playing music together in San Francisco. Scott noted, quote, "I got a bass and she got a guitar, and we didn't know what we were doing, we would just play." He went on to describe his initial fascination with Ruth. He says, quote, "She was almost the scary kind of person. She was like spiked high heels and leather jacket and bleached hair, and it was like, whoa, who's that? I thought she was really cool, but I thought she was unapproachable. I was really attracted to her, but I thought there was no way I'm not that cool. She won't allow me to be in the same room with her." End quote. Over time, the two developed a close bond that has endured. The friends still talk on the phone as often as possible and see each other once a month. Both said they wished they could talk to and see each other more. Ruth says that when she first met Scott, he was living in the gay hotel, that's what she called it, and she therefore took it for granted that he was gay. Similarly, Scott always assumed that Ruth was straight because she'd been married to Tony. Ruth explained how her friendship with Scott was consistent with the friendship she had had since adolescence. She says, quote, "I've had gay male friends since I can remember. I've always gravitated towards artsy people, extending on beyond that, usually musicians and artists, and then gay people are always part of trendy sorts of crowds, especially when I was young." Remember, they met each other in 1977. "Before I knew Scott, when I was a teenager, I had really close gay male friends, but they're all dead." End quote. At the end of her statement, what Ruth is referring to is the fact that she lost a large part of her friendship network during the AIDS and HIV epidemic of the 1980s, as did Scott. The topic arose many times during their interviews. In one instance, Scott explained how losing many friendships during the 1980s affected his life, and he said, quote, "I probably put too much pressure on Ruth because I don't maintain social ties with anyone. Almost everyone I was friends with died, and I have not been social since, so I haven't met a lot of people. So Ruth has had to deal with the burden of me." End quote. And both went on to say that they lost somewhere between 50% and 75% of the social network that they had during that time. So it was a major loss of a large part of their social network. So the two had also talked about parenting together. As Scott says, quote, "Me and Ruth used to talk about having a baby together until we found out I was HIV positive." He said, "So I've always had this sensation that Ruth's daughter, Caroline, was mine." So she ended up having a child, and he was very instrumental in their life, in terms of being there. And he said later in the interview that he's always had a sense that she was kind of his child. Even though he knew, obviously, that it was not his child, he's always felt very close to her. One other thing I wanted to tell you. So Scott describes his friendship with Ruth, and he says, quote, "I just really like Ruth. I like doing things together and working with her. She's like my best friend, my baby sister, just like I like to do things with her. I value my friendship and family, and Ruth's one of the most important people. I'm tempted to say the most important. She's the person who's always been there. When my dad died, I went back and realized how important my family is, but they're not there in the same way that Ruth is. They don't know me like Ruth does. No one knows me the way that Ruth does, so she's the most important." So I read those two passages because I can talk about the book, but it's really in the stories of the people who inhabit the book that it becomes the most alive, that you can see who these people are and what their lives are like and what these relationships mean, beyond just going shopping together as pals, which is what a lot of people did. In fact, they do like to shop together. I should be clear. That's not to say that they don't. They do. But as we see in the case of Ruth and Scott, we see a bond that is so important to both of them that it really takes the place. Family doesn't even really explain it in the way we sometimes think about family. It's a bond that doesn't really have a label. So I want to talk a little bit about gender and the ways that gender plays out. And I won't talk about this for too long because I want to leave plenty of time to talk about. I want to leave plenty of time for questions and for you to ask about things that maybe I'm not talking about right now, because there's a lot in here, and I have to choose just a little sliver of it to share with you. So I'm figuring that if you have things you want to ask, I want to leave plenty of time for that. So gender. I think you probably all know the difference between sex and gender, but for those of you who haven't spent a lot of time in a college classroom in a while, or haven't thought about these issues as frequently as I and my colleagues have, we usually think about sex as being sort of the more biologically based part of being male or female, although there are blendings in between, also true, and gender as being the norms and the behaviors and the identities that have to do with those biological parts. That is such a crude explanation, and I don't expect you to understand exactly what I mean by that. But it's at least it's getting us there. I'm separating sex and gender, right? Okay. I've been teaching all day. All day. Okay, so I talk about gender in terms of policing, and then in terms of basically gender cops and robbers is what I call it. Gender policing, which is a Kate Bornstein term. For those who don't know Kate Bornstein, she's a lovely speaker of the transsexual community. And gender outlaws is my Kate Bornstein term. So the ways that we have gender policing going on, meaning that we're upholding some of the social norms about gender, or gender norms that exist. At times, gay men police straight women's appearance. And what I mean by this is that there's a lot of attention paid to the way people look. And I'll give you a couple examples. I'll read actually. Many straight female participants indicated that they value the attention their gay male friends pay to their appearance, in addition to other aspects of their friends' personalities. Nadia, a 30-year-old straight Iranian-American woman, says, "They're complimentary. They'll tell you when something doesn't look good on you. They're polite, they're courteous, they're kind, they're just good friends." Mark, who is gay, and Christina, who is straight, had this was an exchange that I had with them individually. Mark identified some of Christina's positive qualities. He says, a lot of my gay friends say, you're living vicariously through Christina. You want her height, you want her boobs, her body, her figure. She's very much a woman, very much a girl. She shaves every day. We call Sundays pedicure Sundays. We get them every Sunday. There's not a masculine bone in her, honestly. But then in the next breath, Mark focuses on Christina's gender non-conforming behaviors. And he says, but she does things for herself. She can check oil and do stuff like that. But her mannerisms, her nails, she's just a girl. She's every gay man's fantasy of being a woman. So in this we see in here we see a reinforcing of both a gay male stereotype and the gender norms for what women are supposed to look like going on simultaneously in this one example. This is what I mean by gender policing. Another way that gender gets policed is through the phrase, gay man trapped in a straight woman's body. This got used quite a bit, actually, and I wasn't quite expecting it. Monique, who's a 30-year-old straight woman, she's white, gave a very multi-dimensional explanation of what she meant by this. She says, I call myself queer, in a way because I'm very queer identified and I know what it's like to have it hard. You know what I mean? To be told that there's something fundamentally wrong with you, and I think maybe that's something gay men identify with. I also have the ability to code switch, the affinity for music, for urban life, but also a certain refinement. You know what I mean? There's a difference between being street smart and being able to code switch and being ghetto. You know what I mean? Like, I don't identify with being ghetto, and to me, that's a state of mind, not a place. And I like men, so that's another way of saying, this is her quote, a fag in a woman's body. I have trouble with the word fag. Can't say it. But the idea here is what she's basically saying is she sees herself, and many of the women identified themselves as being, quote, a gay man trapped in a straight woman's body. But again, that is reinforcing this one particular viewpoint of what it means to be a gay man. So in this particular instance, gay masculinity is being policed. And the way that I saw the policing happening was that I'm guessing that these straight women, when they go out in the world and meet people who are not gay, they probably don't introduce themselves and say, hi, I'm Monique, gay man trapped in a straight woman's body. It's probably a very situational type of way of dealing with gender and their own identities. Gender was also policed in the study by both gay and straight men by reinforcing the social expectation that women are unconditionally nurturing, which has both positive and negative dimensions. Seems like a positive thing to have interactions with people who are unconditionally nurturing. That seems like a good thing. But when it's attached to gender and expected of women regularly, that's where it gets a little bit questionable. We might be reinforcing some of the stereotypes that exist. Frank, a 32-year-old gay man, explained the comfort he found in his friendship with Rebecca. He says, quote, no matter how I screw up or bottom out, or what horrible things I say or do, or how horrible I feel about myself, I always know she will be there for me, even in the worst situation. I know I can count on her to come help me out. So it's not a bad thing. It's just that when it gets assigned by gender, it starts to reinforce these stereotypes. All right, gender outlaws. Because on the one hand, we have the policing, on the other hand, we have the outlaws. And I'll just go, this will take a couple minutes, and then I'll be ready to take your questions. So gender and gender expression were sometimes confounded in the lesbian straight man pairs. The lesbians talked a lot about enjoying masculine coded activities, playing pool together in a mostly male environment. Vanessa, she characterized the differences between herself and her friend Bruce, and she says, quote, he watches films and I watch movies. Something's got to get blown up for me to be interested. And I think maybe he's really a lesbian and I'm really a straight guy. It would explain so much. So here she's playfully commenting on the differences in their atypical gender interest. But one of the most interesting things is while the straight women would call themselves a gay man trapped in a straight woman's body, it was only the women who identified the straight men as potentially being a woman in a man's body, right? So the men were not willing to identify that about themselves at all, most likely because of the gender norms of heterosexual masculinity. But that was an interesting thing to notice. And it was viewed as somehow being more unconventional than women saying that they are a gay man trapped in a straight woman's body. Another thing that another place where I paid attention to the gender outlaw behavior was in the women's claiming of the identity of fag hag. People heard this term before? It's okay if you haven't. I think it's gone out of style, which I'm very happy about because I do not like the term either. There's lots of different terminologies. Have you heard of fruit flies? That's another one. There was another one. Queen bees, fruit flies. The idea is straight women who tend to associate with gay men. The most enduring has been the fag hag, which again I have trouble saying, but it's apparently not right now. So Crystal was one of the straight women who talked about having a close gay male friend, and she said, I think it can be really good for a woman like me who's single to have that kind of male energy around her. In general, the fag hag persona is very negative. However, I think that, and through my analyses, I really make the argument that in a way, what this is doing is allowing women to say the expected behaviors of straight women are too conforming or too constricting for me to really express how I feel. Zoe does a really good job of explaining this, and she says, quote, you get to be a whole person. Back when I was younger and more concerned with these things, I didn't have to be feminine. I could be myself, and I could be loud, and I could be funny, and I could be bawdy, and all of those things would be totally embraced. That's what people would think was great about me, as opposed to being considered unfeminine. I think I gave up that whole concept, but earlier in my evolution, I think I thought I had to be a certain way. How you're supposed to eat like a bird and all that stupid stuff, do aerobics, be a certain size and all of those things. None of that mattered. And my gay friends certainly will aesthetically appreciate that perhaps in somebody, but it wasn't going to be a part of my being in their life because they thought I was great and I could take up space and be myself, end quote. So those are the parts I wanted to bring out in talking about gender. We've got some ways in which gender norms are being reinforced. And then we've got some ways in which the norms of gender are being pushed a little bit. The gender outlaw behavior. The thing about the book and the thing about the study that I found really difficult to convey is it's not all one or all the other, that it's a mix of both, and that it's just in keeping with human behavior, and that sometimes it's messy and sometimes it's inconsistent, and that somehow these friends seem to be able to create and sustain these friendships that are incredibly meaningful to them, partly because of the differences in identities, or at least that's what they perceive, but it's also because they seem to be brave and that they're willing to push the boundaries of what's considered to be acceptable and really maybe come up with new definitions for friendship and family and something that we don't even have a name for at this point. So I'll leave it with that, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Hi, my name is Brianna Thorpe, and I actually had two questions.
Okay.
My first question was, did you deal with any transgender, intersex, or genderqueer individuals and their friendships with others? And then my second question, well, actually it's more of a statement, so I'll wait for that.
Okay. Okay, so it's a good question. At the time when I started this, honestly, I started this project in 2000. And that might sound like a really long time ago to some people, and it might sound like 10 minutes ago to everyone. And to me, it sounds like 10 minutes ago.
Yeah.
But what I will say is a lot has changed in the state of feminist work, in gender studies, in that time. And it's not an excuse. It's just where the work was coming from. I specifically wanted to look at gay-straight friendships because I wanted to focus on the expectation that when we removed the possibility for romantic interaction or sexual tension and things like that, how would the friendships respond, right? How would they behave? And with transgender issues and intersex, I didn't want to confound the particular dynamic that I wanted to look at. Also, truly, at that point in time, that was not on the radar. There has been such an incredible, growth in the area of work on transgender issues and intersex, which truly has been even more recently come to than transgender, that it just wasn't even on the radar when I started this. Now, if I had my choice, I mean, if anybody who's written a book or is writing a book can tell you, you could write that book forever. Like, you could keep revising it, and you will know everything that's wrong with it more than any other person who could possibly come to it and read it. What I will say is that one of the things that I wish I had done, again, there's only so much you can do, is looked more at the ways that people inhabited their gender identities in more nonconforming ways. So not just the behaviors between the friends, but the individuals themselves. If they viewed themselves as being more, as you said, genderqueer, but again, I think that was coming around. I was in the Bay Area, and so I'm sure people were using that term. It just wasn't something that was really part of the lexicon that I was using at that point in time. So I think it's a really fair question, and the answer is no, I didn't include them. But there were strategic reasons why, and there's strategic reasons why I didn't include bisexuals either, and it was for the same reason. I thought it would get really muddy in trying to deal with friendship dynamics that might differ if there was the possibility of any kind of sexual relationship. Now, I mean, in doing the work, it's really, there were couples who had sex, or pairs who had sex. Did I know that was going to be there? No. But they did. And it's because as if people who study sexuality understand that there's this continuum, and so it's not not nice and cut and dry. It's not like this is what I am and this is what I do. It's a lot more murky and it's a lot more complicated. And so I think that some of the assumptions were false in thinking about ways to look at the relationships absent those kinds of pressures. And you had a statement?
Yeah, I just wanted to say about the whole word, like, fag hag.
Mm-hmm.
I hate that word.
Mm-hmm.
I despise it. Like, I kicked it out of my vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you say that, it's kind of like you're saying, oh, this is my gay best friend.
Okay.
Well, why can't he be just your best friend?
Yeah.
I've always found refuge in having friendships with gays, lesbians, everyone, because they respect the fact that I can be me and that I can be free to express myself, because most of the time they are ostracized for being who they are and expressing themselves. And so that's where I connect on that level. So I just wanted to say, like, I'm with you on the fact.
I don't like it either. But, it's a useful term to talk. And when you're doing the research and doing the interviews, it's actually a useful way to have the conversation. And some of these women were really like, I claim it. And they claimed it not because they liked the terminology, but because of what you just said in terms of it allowed what they described as a more authentic, or a way that they felt more authentic about being themselves. They felt like they could be less inhibited and less censored, right? And so, yeah, I'm with you on that. Yeah.
Yes, I'd be interested in knowing what questions you asked in the interviews.
Okay. Well, in the back of the book, there are a list of, there's my interview schedule is Appendix 3, and there are a list of 53 questions that I asked. I, of course, riffed on these a little bit. Like, there were times when they would start saying something, and I'd be like, oh, tell me more about that. But the idea is this was what I did, and I split it up into learning. I mean, one of the most basic questions that I wanted to know was, how did you become friends? Like, have you been friends for a long time? Have you been friends only, did you meet each other at work? How did you meet? So it's general questions about the friendship, and then I got into more depth in asking questions like, well, what do you do together? Do you spend special occasions together? When did that start? Just getting a sense of, first, how did they meet? How did the friendship form? And then getting a sense of the qualities of the friendships and the activities they were involved in. And then really getting at, is there something that this friendship gives you that others don't? And can you characterize that for me? And then I got to the question of, have you ever been sexually involved with whoever the person was? And most people would giggle. There was one interview that like stony face shut down on the women's part. She was like, "What did he say?" And I was like, "Oh." And the rest of that interview didn't go very well. But there were only about 5 questions left, so. But it was really, so there was a whole range of things that I asked about. I just really wanted to get a sense of what this friendship was like for them.
Did you ever ask them about how others treated their relationship?
Sure. Yeah, I asked if they felt pressure from other people, and there was around the time I started working on this, there was a article in Cosmopolitan, which I don't read, but somebody sent it to me, or I found it some way, and it was about, or maybe somebody left it in my mailbox. I don't know. It was like a suggestion, like on why you should be careful if you're a straight woman with having too many gay male friends. Because it can ruin you for heterosexual relationships. And I was like, okay. So, but I think that's part of that. So there was, it depends on how involved people were. People thought, from the outside, people would think they were a couple. There was that, unless they knew them. There was a lesbian and straight male pairing who used to go to gaming conferences together. They liked to play games. Okay, good. People know. Because I didn't know. I was like, what are you talking about? This is gaming. So they went to these gaming conferences together, and they said they would try to pick up people together, but it would never work because everybody thought they were a couple all the time. And so they did talk about that. There were some negative kinds of things that family would say. Well, why are you spending so much time together? Don't you think, are you sure that person's gay or lesbian? Are you sure? So there was a lot of questioning. I wouldn't say that it was to the point where people felt like they had to hide their friendships, but they definitely mentioned feeling kind of awkward. And then there was also the pressure from romantic partners, right? So in general, it made it okay. So there was one pair, a lesbian straight man, where she went along to all of his pre-wedding festivities, and she was the only woman there, and she had a great time. And he said, my wife was okay with that, but I kind of wonder if she was a straight woman, how she would have felt about that, and all of the time they spent together. And if if one was sleeping over at the other's house, would the romantic partner feel jealous? Sometimes it was jealousy about a concern that the relationship might be more than the friendships that they obviously had and cared about each other for. But then other times it was just that the friendship was so close it was something that the partner couldn't participate in. So there were a lot of different takes on that, right? There were, but people, there was some negative feedback. But I don't know if the closeness piece of it that a partner couldn't participate in, if that is something that's just more general to friendships, if that had something to do with it or not, if the cross-sexuality.
2 very quick questions. Thank you, Anna. Did you look at any same-sex friendships? So straight man, gay man, straight woman, lesbian woman?
Yes.
And then just the second question, how the sort of friendship pairs work in the broader context of sort of friendship networks and groups, and I don't know if that entered into your study at all.
So did I interview any like cross-sexual orientation friendship? The answer to that is no. Primarily because I really was interested in that dynamic of different sex. Also, there was a book. Well, it actually has not come out, but there was a book that I knew was coming out about gay straight male friendships, and so I didn't want to march all over that territory. I thought better left to the person who was doing it, although the book does not appear to have ever come out, which, who knows? It's a miracle this thing ever came out. I mean, it was good work, but these are big projects. So I did not do that. I wanted to do it all, right? When I sat down, I was like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do gay, straight, gay male, straight female. I'm going to do gay male, straight male. I'm going to do gay, and I bisexual. And my dissertation, one of my advisors was like, no, you'll never finish. You will never be done with this. And I was like, okay, that was a really good piece of advice because I couldn't do it all. It took long enough. So the second question about networks, I have some of that information. I did ask questions. Is this your only gay or lesbian friend, for example, to the straight people, to the gay and lesbian folks? Is this your only straight friends? Trying to get a sense of how much the networks. Is this part of a larger group of people, or is this the one? And then, so that was one way I looked at it. Another way I looked at it was trying to get a sense of, do these friends know your other friends, and do they hang out with your family members, and just trying to get a sense of that. And that really varied. There was a lot of variation in that. I will say that in general, how do I put this? In general, if the friendships were forged in early, say pre-college, pre-high school, if they were formed really early in life, it was more likely that the friendships, the gay-straight friendship, was going to be the only one in that straight person's life. So I had several examples where the people were friends in elementary school. They met really early, and then within the context of the friendship, one of the people came out as gay or lesbian, and that friendship persisted. In those cases, where the straight person often only had that one gay or lesbian friend as a gay or lesbian friendship, they didn't have a whole network. So it was probably something that was unique about that friendship, where that was forged early in their life and that they wanted to maintain and hold on to, but they didn't necessarily have a wider friendship network that included LGBT folks or LG folks. So I think that's probably the best kind of connection I can make in terms of the networks. Yeah, Jeffrey.
I'm wondering whether any of the gay men that you talked to talked about their relationship with straight women as kind of a relief from the sometimes oppressive identity politics of the gay community. That sometimes says, okay, you're a gay man, you have to conform to this.
Right.
Yeah, the stereotype doesn't just come from outside.
No, right, absolutely.
Be within the community too.
They absolutely talked about it, and what they talked about it in a little bit of a different way, though. They didn't talk about it in terms of so the lesbians were more likely to talk about it being a relief with the straight men from the lesbian politics of sort of feeling like they needed to be super lesbian all the time. And by that, I mean like they had to hold a certain political stance, and they had to be vigilant about their identity. So they talked about that more in terms of the identity piece of it. But the gay men talked about it as a relief that they didn't feel like they had to constantly measure up to whatever their friends were doing or whatever they looked like, or trying to be any particular thing. So there was in that way. It wasn't necessarily discussed in sort of the policing that goes on in terms of attitudes or behaviors, but it was more about just feeling a relief that you don't have to be like attractive to everybody all the time, and you don't have to be on the make, especially with younger men. You don't always have to be looking for somebody to sleep with or somebody to hook up with, or what so there was definitely that.
Just a quick follow-up. I can at least imagine a situation where the gay man's friendship with the straight woman is the only opportunity he has for his masculinity to be appreciated, right, and really to be valued apart from sexual orientation.
Yeah, so, it really depended. They didn't talk about that, which is really interesting to me. They did not talk about feeling like their masculinity was reinforced. They talked about having contact with heterosexual family units, for example. And I should be really clear that this was prior to the same-sex marriage debates that have gone on. This was 2000, right? The same-sex marriage debates that have gone on have really affected the conversation in different ways. At the time, though, the gay men, even though there were Daddy and Papa came out in the early 2000s, and they were there. But as far as I could tell, the men that I interviewed did not really see themselves as having access to a family life that involved children. They didn't see that as a possibility. And so their friendship vis-a-vis the women, their straight women friends, was the way. And so they were very aware of that. But they didn't talk about it in terms of masculinity. And I thought that one of the reasons I thought that might be the case is because, and maybe this is just a perception of sort of more contemporary, but there seem to be different types of masculinity within gay male community. Maybe it's subcultures or things like that, that perhaps it's because there's those kinds of subcultures that exist, so they don't feel like they need to go outside of it per se. But there's definitely a discussion about children and family, and really holding that very close, and finding that to be a very important part of those relationships. Yeah.
Sort of related to some of these things about gender identities as being some parallel to the sexual identities. I'm really curious about the straight women in these friendships in the way that, and you talked about this a little bit at the beginning in terms of the straight people becoming a little more politicized, but not quote unquote overboard.
Right.
And I'm wondering though, and then the thing that you were saying about the women referring to herself as straight woman or like gay man trap, which kind of grates on me a little bit just because it's so heteronormative and regulatory. But I'm wondering though, at the same time, if some of these straight women really sort of understood maybe their own gender identities in a way that was a little bit less fixed. In other words, did any of them come to sort of queer their straightness? Like, did any of them talk about themselves as being femme?
Right.
Or
they did not use that language at all.
okay.
There is, it's really interesting. So I did a session, and this is completely related to what you just asked. I did a session at a sociology conference where one of the people who they do these things called author meets critic, or author meets readers at these sociology conferences. I don't know if it's common in other disciplines. I was surprised myself. So anyway, but there I was. And one of the people on the panel was actually making the observation that he thought what I was doing in the book, and that I needed to push it further, was queering heterosexuality in a way, or queering sort of the straight women. I was like, yeah, I probably was. But at the time, again, it's sort of, the women did not talk about themselves as being femme per se, or femme. I call it femme because I lived in the area in the 1990s, and that's what you do. But they did talk about it. Like, there was one quote that I read from Monique, and she talked about herself as identifying as queer. And there was a straight man who did not call himself queer, but his friend identified him as being sort of queer identified, even though he himself didn't. So I think it's there in some instances. I didn't necessarily call it queering, but this colleague of mine said, yes, that's what you're doing.
Well, no, what my question was, do people understand themselves doing that, or is that a thing that, sort of queer theory of,
I think that they don't. I think that Monique did, and I think she had the language of queer theory, because it's what she took in college. And the one guy who was identified as sort of queer identified, he is in his late 40s now, was in his early 40s at the time, maybe. And he called himself, he basically said, well, I was a women's studies minor in college, and so I thought about these things extensively. So there were clear moments where those people who did really queer their gender identity stuck out. But in general, I would say that most people did not talk about it. They didn't. And it's interesting, and it's also, it's also contextual in a way, because like I said, I started this in 2000, and I know these conversations were going on. They just were not going on in my sociology department and with my dissertation people. They were not going on in that way. And so a lot of this comes out of that conversation of whatever it is you're doing at the time and whatever the scholarship is at the time. And I just think that it's moved so far forward in the last 12 years since I started working on this. And at just 12 years, it kind of hurts me a little bit. But it was 12 years. It was 12 years. Yeah, Adam.
First of all, your comment about gender policing has me feeling really foolish and guilty for spending the first part of the talk thinking, I have not seen Anna wear that shirt before. But it is very cute.
It's all right. It's all right.
You've been talking a lot about change over time and thinking, God, these data were collected in 2000.
Yeah.
How the discussion has changed. Generation, in what way do you think generation is moderating this, and where do you think we're going in terms of the special relationship that I think gay men and straight women and lesbian women and heterosexual men have had? Do you think that is going to change as we move forward?
So, I could give you a short answer, which would be maybe, which is how's that for non-committal? But could be. I think that one of the cautionary things I talk about at the end of the book is this very piece. And one of the things that is a little concerning to me, and I don't mean it concerning in any way except for talking about these friendships, which of course I have, and so I am concerned just a little bit, is the fact that I think that marriage, same-sex marriage, could change some of these things. And in terms of having the option of legally marrying a partner, same-sex partner, it might change things. And part of the reason I say that is because the gay men in the study, and this is sort of what I'm basing it on, the gay men in the study talked about how they're concerned, I called it sort of an anxious bond, in that they're concerned, or they voiced concern that as their straight female friends got more centered in family life, had children, and their family became more of the center of their world, that their friendships would be less meaningful to the women. They were very concerned about that. The lesbians didn't seem as concerned, but the gay men were really concerned about it. And so just basing it off of that, I think I am a little concerned about that. Not saying that obviously obviously it's a civil right and people should be able to do that, but I do think that it may change some of the dynamics in that these really kind of are, in some ways, what we might call queer friendships. Right? They're friendships that fit in some ways but don't fit in others. They defy definition. In a lot of ways, they're sort of family-ish and sort of friendship-ish, and they take on these different things. And I wonder if, by virtue of institutionalizing the same-sex relationship, which I think is, like I said, a beneficial thing, I wonder what the future of the friendships will be, these kinds of friendships. Because I think it has emerged maybe out of some, I don't want to say utility, because it's not just about having a close friendship. It's about the ways that it sort of mediates these spaces that people sometimes don't feel like they fit into. And if everybody's fitting into a space, then I don't know where those spaces are going to be anymore, if that makes sense. And so it's not, I don't want to be, it's not like, oh well, too bad for the odd couples. But I do think that there are, I will be really interested to see what happens over time.
Because it seems like one of the oddest couples of all is the gay man, straight man friendship, which I think many gay men have shied away from over the years. But we're really seeing so many more public portrayals of that. And I see it in our students.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering how that too is going to come in and potentially change the dynamic of the gay male, straight female, and so forth.
I agree with you 100%. And what's also interesting, so I'm sort of predicting the downfall of the odd couple, but what it's also really interesting is exactly what you said, the generational shift in terms of the younger, and then of course it's not everyone, but in general the trends are that younger people are far more accepting of people being whatever their background is. And obviously there's still racism and there's still classism and there's still homophobia. That can all still exist. But in general, there seems to be a greater willingness to accept difference in terms of these identity categories. And so the friendships do exist. Well, and the thing I always tell my students, I was like, oh, come on. In high school, nobody was out. There was nobody out in my high school. Nobody. The proms, people didn't go to with their same-sex partner to a prom. Like, no, that did not happen. And so then they look at me like, what are you talking about? Like, you must be so old. But it's true. Nobody was out. No one. And so and not only that, if you had sex in the 80s, you would die. That is, and I don't mean that, like, I really mean that. That was what happened. That was the message you received. It was such a different framework that, they're not coming at it from that angle anymore. It just isn't where I see young people being. I see them as being accepting of same-sex family members and same-sex friends and coming out in middle school and high school. And that's such an enormous change that it's hard to know where it's going to go given that is, where we are socially. I mean, I don't mean to say it's all rainbows and flowers and happy and songs and lemonade. Well, although there's lemonade over there, but I'm not trying to say that it's all of those things. But what I'm saying is that there's obviously still really awful things that happen, and there's hate crimes that go on and on. But in general, if you look at the trends, the younger folks just seem to be more accepting as a generation, and so I don't know what's going to happen. I'm a little pessimistic on the friendship tip, but I'm a lot optimistic in the fact that there seems to be greater acceptance going on.